The gun was already in his hand when Margaret Barrett realized she had made the worst mistake of her life. Not the mistake of coming west. Not the mistake of answering the advertisement in the Cincinnati Gazette that had read simply, "Rancher seeks capable woman of sound mind and steady constitution for life on the Wyoming frontier. Hardship guaranteed. Loneliness not." Not even the mistake of boarding the Union Pacific at dawn 3 weeks ago with 2 trunks and a fury she had convinced herself was courage. The mistake was trusting Franklin Holt. He stood in the doorway of the supply house with the lamplight cutting across his face, and he was smiling in a way that made her stomach drop like a stone into winter water. Beside him stood 2 men she had never seen before, both armed, both watching her with the patient, predatory stillness of men who had done this before and expected to do it again. "Miss Barrett," Franklin said, and his voice had shed every trace of the warmth he had shown her over 3 days in Laramie while she waited for the man she had come to marry. "I think you already understand that Mr. Alden isn't coming for you." "You told me he sent word," she said. Her own voice surprised her. It was steady. She had not known it would be. "I told you a great many things." Franklin tilted his head and the smile widened. "The land grant he holds, I need it. The water rights attached to it, I need those too. And a woman who came all this way on a promise of marriage, well, she has no legal standing in Wyoming territory, no family within 2,000 miles, no one who would think to look for her." The word trap formed in her mind, clear and cold as a brand. She had walked straight into it. And then the door behind Franklin Holt exploded inward, and Emmett Alden came through it like a man who had been riding through the dark for 36 hours and had nothing left inside him except the specific, burning intention to reach her in time. He was bleeding from a cut above his eye, and his coat was torn at the shoulder, and he was, without question, the most frightening and the most welcome thing Margaret Barrett had ever seen. The gun in his hand tracked to Franklin Holt in a single fluid motion that spoke of a man who had not always lived a peaceful life. "Step away from her," Emmett said, and his voice carried no particular emotion at all, which somehow made it worse. "Right now. Both of you behind him, hands up. Mr. Holt, you and I have a conversation overdue by about 4 years, and we are going to have it tonight, but not while she is standing in the middle of it." This is where the story truly begins. Not at that gunpoint moment, though it would haunt Margaret's dreams for months afterward. It begins 3 weeks earlier, in Cincinnati, on the day she answered an advertisement she almost threw away. Margaret Barrett was 26 years old, the daughter of a printer who had died of a chest fever in the winter of 1878, and she had been making her living since then as a seamstress in the shop of a widow named Mrs. Crane, who paid her fairly and treated her coldly and reminded Margaret every single day, through the silent arithmetic of small cruelties, that a woman without a husband in 1879 was a woman without a future. Margaret had watched that future shrink like cloth in hot water, growing tighter and less recognizable with each passing season, until one Tuesday morning in late March she had unfolded the Cincinnati Gazette over her breakfast and read the advertisement twice, and then a third time, and then set down her coffee cup with a click that felt, in its small way, like a declaration. She had not answered it impulsively. That was important to her afterward, when people who had not been there offered their opinions. She had taken 4 days. She had written 3 different versions of her reply. She had walked twice to the post office and twice turned back. She was not a woman who acted without thinking. She was a woman who had thought so much and for so long about the walls of her life that she had finally thought herself past them. The advertisement had been placed by a man named Emmett Alden of Sweetwater County, Wyoming Territory. He was, he wrote, 31 years of age and the owner of a cattle operation of modest but solvent size on the eastern edge of the Wind River foothills. He sought a woman of practical mind and genuine character, not simply a housekeeper, but a partner in the fullest sense of the word. He wrote that Wyoming was brutal and beautiful, and that he would not pretend otherwise. He wrote that the winters could kill a person who was not prepared for them in spirit as much as in body. He wrote, and this was the line that had made her sit back and read it a fourth time, that he had lost 2 good people to this land already, and that he would not bring another soul out here under false promises. He asked only for honesty in return. She had sent her reply on the Thursday morning. His answer had arrived 18 days later, a single page written in a handwriting that was careful and slightly cramped, as though the writer was more accustomed to working with rope than with pen. He thanked her for her frankness and responded to each of her questions in turn, without evasion. He told her the elevation. He told her the distance to the nearest town, which was a settlement called River Bend, 22 miles south. He told her that he employed 3 hands year-round and 2 more in the summer months, and that she would not be isolated, but that she would need to mean it when she said she could stand the quiet. She had written back the same day. And so it had gone, letter by letter across a distance of nearly 2,000 miles, for 6 weeks, until the letters had built something between them that was not yet love but was already more than mere arrangement. It was a specific kind of trust, the fragile, deliberate trust of 2 people who had both been burned and were extending their hands anyway carefully over the heat. He had sent her a train ticket in late May with a letter that said he would meet her in Laramie on the 20th of June, and that he was not a man who made promises without intending to keep them. He had told her to send word if she changed her mind, and that he would not think less of her. She did not change her mind. The journey west on the Union Pacific was 31 hours from Chicago, where she had changed trains at the depot on Canal Street. She sat in the second-class car with her 2 trunks in the luggage hold, and watched the country change outside the window in a way that felt less like travel and more like the world unmaking itself. The green softness of Ohio giving way to the flat, enormous sky of the plains, and then to the beginning of a landscape so indifferent to human presence that it made her chest tighten with something that was not quite fear and not quite wonder, but held the quality of both. She arrived in Laramie on the morning of June 20th at 9:30. Emmett Alden was not at the station. She stood on the platform with her 2 trunks in the June heat already pressing down and watched the other passengers disperse until she was alone, and she waited. An hour, 2. She told herself there were 100 reasonable explanations. A horse could go lame. A wheel could crack. She had come 2,000 miles. She could wait. It was in the 3rd hour of waiting that a man approached her, genial and well-dressed, with a silver watch chain and a hat that was too clean for the dust of the street, and introduced himself as Franklin Holt, a business associate of Emmett Alden's. He told her with a practiced sympathy that Emmett had sent word, that there was trouble at the ranch, a fence dispute with a neighbor that had turned serious. He would not be able to come to Laramie for at least 3 days, possibly 4, and he had asked Franklin to see that she was comfortable at the hotel and that her needs were attended to. Margaret had looked at Franklin Holt for a long moment. Something in her, some instrument she had developed in 26 years of navigating a world that did not always wish her well, had registered a faint, discordant note. But she was tired and hot, and the trunks were heavy, and she had come 2,000 miles. She went with him to the hotel. For 3 days, Franklin was attentive and plausible. He ate supper with her at the hotel dining room each evening and told her about Emmett's ranch and about the country in ways that confirmed enough of what Emmett had written in his letters to seem credible. He never pushed. He never pressed. He was simply there, always available, always smooth. On the 3rd evening, he told her he needed to collect a ledger from the supply house down the street, and that she might as well come along since they were on their way back from dinner, and it would only take a moment. It took a moment too long. She understood the trap the instant she heard the second pair of boots come in behind her and the door of the supply house close. But Emmett was already on his way. He had never sent word. The letter from the railroad office telling Margaret of the delay had been written by Franklin Holt, who had a hand that could approximate other hands, a skill he had developed years ago in a trade that had nothing to do with cattle. Emmett had arrived at the Laramie station on the afternoon of June 20th, 4 hours after Margaret, and found no one waiting. He had gone to the hotel and found no record of a Margaret Barrett. He had spent 6 increasingly frantic hours working his way through every establishment in Laramie before a stable boy, 12 years old and sharp-eyed, told him he had seen a woman with 2 big trunks go into the Riordan Hotel with Mr. Holt on the morning of the 20th. The name Franklin Holt had landed on Emmett Alden like a hand around his throat. He had ridden back to the hotel at a pace that alarmed his horse and taken the stairs 3 at a time, and found Margaret's room empty and the bed unslept in. And then he had done the thing he was best at in a crisis, which was to stop moving entirely for 30 seconds and think. The supply house. Holt had always used Morrow's supply house for things he did not want witnessed. He had run the 3 blocks. Now, in the warm aftermath of that broken door and that extended gun, and the particular silence of men who have just understood that the balance of power has shifted irreversibly against them, Franklin Holt looked at Emmett Alden with an expression that cycled rapidly through contempt and calculation and finally arrived, with visible reluctance, at something approaching caution. "You're bleeding," Margaret said to Emmett, not because it was the most important thing but because it was the first thing her mouth chose. He glanced at her sideways without lowering the gun. "It's a small cut. Are you hurt?" "No." "Good." His eyes went back to Holt. "On the floor, Franklin, both of you. Now." The sheriff arrived 11 minutes later, responding to the shot that one of Holt's men had fired wide and wild when things came apart, a shot that had done nothing except wake up half the street and bring Deputy Calloway at a run. What followed was 2 hours of statements and depositions, and the kind of administrative machinery that moves slowly but does eventually move. And by the end of it, Franklin Holt and his 2 men were in the Laramie jail on charges of criminal conspiracy and unlawful confinement. And Emmett Alden was sitting across from Margaret Barrett in the hotel dining room at 1 in the morning, with 2 cups of coffee between them that neither of them was drinking. He had a bandage above his eye now, applied somewhat imperfectly by himself in the mirror of the washroom. His coat was still torn. He had the look of a man who was accustomed to managing his own state with whatever materials were available and expecting no particular sympathy for it. Margaret watched him for a moment. He was not what she had constructed in her imagination from those 6 weeks of letters. He was taller, and the planes of his face were more severe, weathered in a way that spoke of long hours in high-altitude sun. His eyes were a dark, direct gray, and they held a quality she recognized immediately because she had it herself. The quality of a person who has learned to assess situations quickly and without sentiment, because sentimentality has cost them before. But there was something else in his face right now, beneath the controlled exterior, something she might not have caught if she had not spent years reading the small truths people hid in the corners of their expressions. He was shaken, not by the confrontation with Holt, by something older and more interior than that. "You wrote that you lost 2 people to this land," she said quietly, not looking for a reaction but wanting to acknowledge it. His jaw tightened. He did not answer immediately. "My wife," he said at last. "Eleanor, 3 years ago, second winter after we came out, and before that my brother James, who came with me in the first year. Fever." He paused. "I wrote it because you deserve to know what you were considering. This country does not make allowances. And you thought if I knew that and still came, it meant something. I thought if you knew that and still came, it meant you were real." He looked at her directly. "I have spent 4 years building something out there that takes everything I have. I don't have room for pretense. I'm not built for it." Margaret thought of her life in Cincinnati, the small room above Mrs. Crane's shop. The evenings that were indistinguishable from each other, the future that fit her like a garment cut too small. "Neither am I," she said. He reached across the table and picked up his coffee cup, and she noticed his hands, the knuckles scarred, the wrists broad, the hands of a man who did not have to consider twice what work looked like. and she noticed that his hands, which had held a gun without trembling 2 hours ago, were not entirely steady now. She did not point it out. She picked up her own cup. "Franklin Holt," she said. "You know him." "From before. When I first came out, I had a partner in the cattle operation. A man named Denton. Holt was Denton's cousin, and he decided the land Denton and I had filed on was sitting on an underground water source that would be worth a great deal if the territory kept growing. He made offers. We refused. Denton sold his share to me eventually and moved on, and I thought that was the end of it." His mouth thinned. "I should have known better. A man like Holt doesn't let go of a thing he's decided is his. He used me as a lever. He was going to use you as proof of death, more likely." He said it simply, without drama. "A woman with no family in 2,000 miles, no legal status, no witnesses. He's done it before. There are stories if you look for them." The word death settled between them without panic. Margaret had already thought it, had already turned it over in those long minutes in the supply house when the shape of what was happening became clear. She was not the kind of woman who refused to see things because they frightened her. "Then I suppose," she said, "that I owe you more than punctuality." Something moved in his expression. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the direction of one. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I should have been at the station. If I had been there when I said I would be, you were 4 hours behind me and I was already gone with him. Unless you had managed to arrive before I did, the outcome of the station meeting would have been the same." She set down her cup. "I'm not interested in assigning blame for things that can't be changed. I'd rather talk about what comes next." He studied her for a moment with those direct gray eyes. "Are you still willing," he asked, and the question was careful, stripped of assumption, "to come to the ranch, to see what it is before you commit to anything? I understand if the last 3 days have changed your thinking." Margaret considered. She thought about the supply house and the 2 men and the smile on Franklin Holt's face, and then she thought about the door coming in off its hinges and what it meant that a man had ridden 36 hours through the dark to get there. "I came 2,000 miles, she said. "I'm not going back to Cincinnati because a man I didn't know tried to frighten me." Emmett Alden looked at her for 3 more seconds, and then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has heard something he was afraid he was not going to hear. "We'll leave at first light," he said. The road from Laramie to Sweetwater County took 2 days by wagon in the summer, traversing a landscape that was so relentlessly vast and so indifferent to human scale that Margaret found herself doing something she had not expected, which was falling slightly in love with it before she had fully registered that it was happening. The high plains in June were not gentle. The grass was short and wind-draped. The sky was a blue so absolute it seemed painted, and the mountains to the west stood against it with a permanence that made everything she had ever worried about feel faintly small. Emmett drove the team with the ease of a man who has driven that road so many times it requires no conscious thought, and he talked to her in the way he had written letters, honestly and without embellishment, telling her what she was looking at, naming the ranges and the creek beds, explaining the weather signs she would need to learn, the quality of the light before a fast storm, the way the horses behaved when the pressure dropped. He was not chatty. He did not speak to fill space, but when he spoke, she found herself listening with a concentration that surprised her, the way you listen when someone is telling you something true. On the first evening they stopped at a way station run by a Shoshone man named Thomas and his Anglo wife, a woman named Ruth who had hair the color of iron filings and opinions about everything, and an immediate, unsentimental warmth that Margaret felt like sunshine on cold skin. Ruth fed them elk stew and cornbread and told Margaret, while Emmett was outside seeing to the horses, that Emmett Alden was the most decent man in the county and that whatever she had heard about the county in general, she should not judge him by it. "He's been alone a long time," Ruth said, filling Margaret's cup with coffee strong enough to build a fence out of. "Not from lack of trying. There was a woman from Cheyenne last year, a perfectly reasonable woman, and she lasted 1 winter and left. He didn't blame her. That's the kind of man he is. He never blames anyone. Does he blame himself? Margaret asked. Ruth looked at her sharply, with the sudden, recalibrated attention of a person encountering an unexpected question. Yes, she said after a moment, for his wife. I don't think he'll ever stop. Margaret thought about that for the rest of the evening and said nothing of it. On the second day the country changed, the flat plain giving way to rolling hills and then to higher ground, the grass longer and the sky a different quality, closer somehow. And then in the late afternoon Emmett pointed to a line of cottonwoods along a creek bottom and said, "That's the southern edge of the Alden Range." And something about the way he said it, quiet and without flourish but with a density of feeling he was not entirely hiding, told her that this land was not merely property to him. It was something he had paid for in a currency that had nothing to do with money. The house came into view 20 minutes later, a two-story frame structure that was more substantial than she had expected, with a wide porch facing south and a stone chimney at each end, and a barn behind it that was larger than the house, which she supposed was the correct priority in this business. Two of the hands were visible near the corral, men who looked up when the wagon came through the gate and then looked at Margaret with the careful, neutral expressions of people determining whether a change in their employer's life was going to affect theirs. One of them, a compact, serious man of about 40 with a mustache that had ambitions beyond its station, came forward. Emmett introduced him as Cal Warden, the ranch foreman, and Cal Warden shook Margaret's hand with the formality of a man conducting business, and said it was good to finally meet her, and that if she needed anything the first few days she should ask him because Emmett would forget. "I don't forget," Emmett said. "You forgot to eat for 3 days in March," Cal said, without changing his expression, and went back to the corral. Emmett carried her trunks inside and showed her the house with a focused, efficient thoroughness that was, she realized, a form of nervousness. He pointed out where things were kept and where the water came from and where the extra blankets lived, and then they arrived at the top of the stairs, and he showed her the room he had prepared for her, which was the larger of the 2 bedrooms, and which he had clearly aired and cleaned recently, and there were wildflowers in a jar on the dresser. He said, looking at the middle distance rather than at her, "I understand this is not a thing to rush. The arrangement we discussed is, I want you to understand that there's no pressure. You can be here and find out what this life is before anything is decided, as long as you need." Margaret looked at the wildflowers. They were Indian paintbrush and what she thought might be lupin, the colors vivid and somewhat improbable in the plain frame room. "Who put those there?" she asked. A pause. "I did." She turned and looked at him, and something passed between them in that look that was not yet the full thing but was the beginning of it, the first genuine, unguarded moment between 2 people who had been careful with each other until now. "Thank you," she said. "I'll take good care of the room." The weeks that followed were not romantic in any conventional sense. They were work and learning, and the specific process of 2 contained people discovering each other in the small daily actions that reveal more about a person than any deliberate conversation. Margaret was not a woman who required things explained to her more than once. She watched Emmett with the horses on the second morning, and understood by the afternoon how the stable routine worked, and did it without being asked. She watched Cal demonstrate how the water situation functioned, the well pump and the rain barrel and the creek access, and she did not pretend it was simple when it wasn't, but she did not pretend it was beyond her either. She found the kitchen logic within 4 days and produced the first supper that was not her following a recipe blindly, but her understanding what the pantry held and what would satisfy men who had been working since before sunrise. Emmett ate it without comment, which she had already learned was his form of approval. Cal said it was better than anything Emmett cooked, and that this was not difficult but was still worth noting. On the 6th day it rained hard from mid-morning on, a real summer downpour that turned the yard to mud and brought everyone in from the fields, and in the afternoon Emmett found Margaret at the kitchen table reading the survey documents for the land grant, which she had pulled from the cabinet where he kept the ranch papers. He stopped in the doorway. "I'm trying to understand the water rights dispute," she said, without looking up. "If Holt goes to trial and his associates argue that the original filing was deficient, you need the secondary survey notation on file in Cheyenne. It's there. I found the reference, but you'll need someone to go in person and get a certified copy before trial." He stood there for a moment looking at her the way a man looks when something has caught him entirely unprepared. "How do you know about land filings?" he asked. "My father was a printer. He printed legal documents for 20 years. I set type from the time I was 8. She turned a page. "This secondary survey is your protection. Don't let Holt's lawyers make the argument that the primary filing is deficient without having it in the room." He came and sat down across from her at the table. Outside, the rain hammered the porch roof in a changing rhythm. He looked at the document she was indicating, and then he looked at her. "Margaret," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without the miss in front of it, and they both noticed it. She looked up. "I need to go to Cheyenne," he said, "to handle this and some other business related to the case. I'll be gone 3 days. Will you be all right here with Cal and the boys?" "I'll be fine," she said. "Go." And then, because the moment seemed to warrant a small thing, she said, "Be careful." He held her gaze for 2 seconds longer than he needed to. "I will," he said. He left at dawn the next morning, and she watched him go from the upstairs window, watched him ride south until the land swallowed him, and found herself aware of the specific weight of his absence in a way that told her something important about how much she had been aware of his presence. She did not let herself sit with the feeling long. There was too much to do. While Emmett was gone, she did not merely hold the household together. She reorganized the pantry and the tool storage in the outbuilding in a way that Cal Warden, upon inspection, declared to be superior to its previous arrangement, with the tone of a man making a significant concession. She sat with the youngest of the hands, a 19-year-old named Henry Birch, who had a rattlesnake bite healing on his forearm that was not healing correctly, and cleaned and redressed it with the materials in the medicine cabinet, which Emmett had well stocked, and told Henry to show her every day, and she would tell him if he needed the doctor in River Bend. On the second evening without Emmett, Cal sat with her on the porch after supper, and with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who does not speak his mind easily, told her about Emmett Alden had been a woman from Missouri, the daughter of a doctor, educated, capable, not unprepared. She had come west with love and genuine intention, and the land had tested her and she had met the test, and in her second winter she had developed a pneumonia that the nearest doctor, 40 miles away in the teeth of a January blizzard, could not reach in time. Emmett had ridden for the doctor himself. He had not made it there and back before she was gone. "He blames the country," Cal said, "but mostly he blames himself for bringing her here." "That's not a fair assignment of blame," Margaret said. "No, but it's how grief works sometimes." Cal was quiet for a moment, watching the evening light do what it does in Wyoming, which is to turn the world briefly gold. "I'll tell you something. I've worked for Emmett Alden for 6 years, and I've never seen him pick wildflowers and put them in a room before anyone arrived." Margaret said nothing and looked at the horizon, but she felt the warmth of it settle quietly somewhere useful. Emmett returned on the afternoon of the 4th day instead of the 3rd, which made her aware that she had been tracking the hours in a way she had not entirely admitted to herself. He came in with the certified survey document and a fresh bruise on his jaw as he explained with a brevity that invited no follow-up questions, an encounter with 2 of Holt's men who had tried to intercept him on the road outside Cheyenne. He had the document. The other men did not, by his account, fare particularly well. Margaret looked at the bruise and then looked at him. "You need to eat," she said. He sat at the kitchen table and ate the supper she had kept warm over the stove, and she sat across from him, and they talked for 2 hours without noticing that 2 hours had passed. He told her about Cheyenne, the territory capital, still raw and fast building, the railroad money visible everywhere. She told him about the reorganization of the pantry and about Henry's arm, which was healing properly now. He told her about the lawyer he had retained for the Holt trial, a man named Peterson who had a reputation for both competence and honesty, which combination Emmett said was rarer in territorial law than it ought to be. She told him about a conversation she had had with a woman in River Bend the day before, a woman named Clara Hutchins whose husband had a wheat operation to the east, about whether the winter of 1879 looked like it would come early. "What did you conclude?" he asked. "Clara says it will. She's been here 11 years and she says she can feel it in the way the grass is growing." Margaret paused. "I told her I was new and was relying on people who knew what they were looking at." Emmett smiled. It was the full version, not the directed version, and it changed his face considerably, opened it up, let something through that the controlled expression generally kept private. "You're already doing the most important thing," he said. "What's that?" "Listening to the people who have been here longer than you." It was not a declaration. It was not even, strictly speaking, personal. But it was Emmett Alden, who was careful with everything, saying that she was doing something right in a place he had watched others fail, and she received it as what it was. The summer moved forward. The days were long and full, and the work was real, and the nights were cool at the elevation of the ranch, in a way that made the mornings fresh instead of punishing. Margaret settled into the life with a naturalness that she had hoped for but had not been entirely certain of. The harshness was genuine. It was not romance. The distances were real. The isolation was not metaphorical. There were days of physical labor that left her hands cracked and her back aching in ways that Mrs. Crane's shop had never demanded. There were days when the wind blew without pause from dawn to dark, and the sound of it was almost a presence in the house, something with its own bad temper. But there was also the light, and the silence that was not empty but full, and the specific, daily quality of Emmett's company, which she had begun to understand was something she had been looking for in some form her whole adult life without knowing what to call it. He was not soft. He was not effusive. He would not tell you something unless he meant it, and he did not mean things carelessly. But he was, fundamentally, honest in a way that she found profoundly restful after a lifetime of reading between the lines of what people said. With Emmett, the line and the meaning were in the same place. They worked alongside each other in ways that became, over the weeks, a kind of unspoken vocabulary. She knew, by late July, the meaning of his various silences. She knew when the quietness in him was concentration and when it was something heavier, the old grief that Cal had described, the thing that lived in him permanently like a low note under everything else. On those days she did not try to draw him out. She simply made sure the coffee was hot and that supper was good and that the house was orderly in a way that told him, without requiring him to ask, that someone was paying attention. He noticed. He was not a man who did not notice things. In the last week of July, on an evening when the sky put on a display of color that seemed almost deliberate in its excess, all rose and copper and a purple she had no name for, they sat on the porch after supper and he said without preamble, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "Are you happy?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky. Happy was not a word she had applied to herself in some time. It seemed to her that it described a specific and sometimes fleeting state, different from the steadier things she had been building inside her since she came here. But she considered it honestly, the way she did everything. "I am something better than happy," she said at last. "I'm satisfied in the real sense. I am where I chose to be and I know why I chose it and I do not want to be elsewhere." She paused. "That's rarer than happy, I think." He was looking at her when she finished, and the quality of his looking had changed from what it had been on that first night in the hotel dining room. Then it had been assessment, careful and contained. Now it was something that had no business being contained. He said, "I was not sure when you agreed to come, whether I was being selfish." "In what way?" "In bringing someone else out here, after a leaner." He looked at the darkening horizon. "I told myself it was practical." That the ranch needed I had a list of reasons. A pause. They weren't the real reason. Margaret waited. The real reason, he said, was that I was lonely in a way that the work couldn't reach. And I told myself that was selfish because this land is hard and I knew it was hard, and bringing you into it for the sake of my own. He stopped. Started again. I was afraid of being the reason someone else was damaged by this place. Emmett, she said, and her voice was gentle but also direct, the way you are direct with someone you respect too much to let them carry an unfair weight. You did not bring a leaner here with dishonest intentions. You did not bring me here with them either. You wrote me a letter that said this country could kill a person and that you would not lie about it. She turned in her chair to face him more fully. What you are describing is not selfishness. It is love that lost its person and then was afraid to reach again. That is not the same thing. He looked at her with the full force of those gray eyes, and she saw the thing in them that had been behind the glass all this time, and it was not complicated. It was simply enormous, the feeling of a man who has held himself carefully in check for a long time and is very close to not doing that anymore. I would like, he said, with a deliberateness that made each word feel weighted, to court you properly. If that is agreeable to you, if you are willing, given everything, the country, the distance from your life before, the difficulty of the winters, if you are willing, I would like to do this the right way. Margaret thought about the wildflowers in the jar on the dresser when she had arrived. She thought about 36 hours of riding through the dark. She thought about a letter that said, honestly, that hardship was guaranteed. I think, she said, that you have already been courting me in every way that matters, but I appreciate the formality of the question. The smile came again, the real one, and this time she let herself look at it directly and did not pretend it did not do what it did. The courtship, given its formal declaration in late July, proceeded in ways that were shaped by the realities of the life rather than the conventions of parlor society, and Margaret found that she preferred it that way entirely. There were no calling cards or scheduled visits. There was the daily work and the long evenings, and a new quality of attention between them that required no announcement. He brought her things from the range when he came in, not always deliberately but often, a particularly shaped stone from the creek bed, a feather from a hawk, a bloom from something flowering on the ridge that he thought she might not have seen before, and he offered these things without ceremony, almost as an afterthought, but she understood them for what they were. Small acts of seeing. The thing a person does when someone else has become the measuring stick against which they compare everything interesting they encounter. She read to him in the evenings from the 3 books she had brought from Cincinnati, a collected Dickens, a volume of poetry, and a natural history of North America that turned out to be by far the most useful of the 3. He listened to the Dickens with the concentrated enjoyment of a man who had not had much access to stories, and to the poetry with a careful attention that occasionally produced a reaction he would not have shown if he knew she was watching, a minute shift in his expression at a line that found him somewhere he had not expected. She wrote letters to Ruth at the way station, and Ruth wrote back in a handwriting that was large and confident and full of opinions about weather and people and the proper method of preserving venison. She wrote to Clara Hutchins in River Bend. She did not write to Cincinnati. There was nothing there that required tending. In August, the Franklin Holt matter came to its conclusion. He was convicted in the Laramie Territorial Court on 2 counts of criminal conspiracy and 1 count of unlawful confinement, and sentenced to 7 years in the territorial prison at Laramie. His 2 men received lesser sentences. Emmett's lawyer Peterson presented the secondary survey document, and the attempt by Holt's attorney to argue a deficiency in the land filing failed entirely. The water rights were confirmed as belonging to the Alden Ranch for the duration of the filing, 20 years renewable. Emmett came home from Laramie with this news on a Wednesday evening, and found Margaret on the porch replacing a broken board with a spare length of lumber she had found in the outbuilding, working with a competence that made Cal, who was watching from the barn door, look thoughtful. "It's done," Emmett said. She stood up and looked at him and saw, perhaps for the first time since the hotel dining room in the small hours of June 20th, that the particular tension he had been carrying was gone. Not entirely, he was not a man without burdens, but the specific, taut thread that had run through him since she arrived, the thread of the unresolved danger, was cut. "Good," she said. And then, because the moment had a weight that deserved more than one word, she said, "Come and sit down." And he sat on the porch step and she sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, and the evening settled over the valley below them like something being laid to rest. After a while he said, "What were you planning to do with the porch board if I hadn't come back?" "Finish fixing it," she said, "and then have supper." He made a sound that was a laugh, low and brief, and she felt the warmth of it travel through the 6 inches of air between them. It was the following Sunday, the last Sunday in August, when he kissed her. They had ridden out to the northern pasture to check a stretch of fence that Cal had flagged as needing attention, and they had worked through the afternoon restringing wire in a comfortable, efficient partnership that had become their natural mode. And then they had sat on a rock outcropping above the creek to eat the lunch she had packed and drink water from the creek, which was cold and clear at the source, and tasted of something mineral and clean. The mountain view from the outcropping was extravagant in the way this country was extravagant, without apology or apparent awareness of its own excess. The Wind River Range stood to the northwest in full summer clarity, the peaks still holding snow that would not melt entirely even in August, white against the hard blue. Margaret was looking at the peaks when she became aware that he was looking at her. She turned and met his eyes, and the thing that had been gathering between them all summer was simply, finally, there, present and undeniable, and he reached out and put his hand against her jaw carefully, with a gentleness that was the more striking for the roughness of the hands, and kissed her once, with the same quality as everything he did, unhurried and complete and meaning it fully. She kissed him back. When they separated, neither of them spoke immediately. There was nothing inadequate in the silence. The creek ran below them and the peak stood against the sky, and the world was exactly the size it was, enormous and indifferent and completely present. "I love this country," he said, and she understood that it was not only the country he was saying it about. She took his hand and held it, and they sat there until the light began to shift toward evening, and then rode back to the ranch together, not quickly. The proposal came in September, on a morning when the first real intimation of autumn was in the air, a sharpness and a quality of light that was different from summer, already beginning the preparation the country underwent every year for the serious business of winter. He had not planned it. She could see that from the moment. It arrived in the middle of breakfast in a way that suggested the words had assembled themselves and come out before he had fully decided to let them. He set down his coffee cup and said, "I want you to marry me, Margaret. I want you to be my wife. Not because the ranch needs, I don't want it to be about the ranch. I want it to be about you and me, and the fact that whatever I thought I was doing when I wrote that advertisement, what I actually did was bring you here, and everything I am has been better since you arrived." Margaret set down her own cup. She had known for some time with a certainty that sat quietly in her without requiring examination. But the thing about Emmett's proposal, unlike any other version she might have imagined in her previous life, was that it was entirely without performance. It was simply true. That was what it was. "Yes," she said. He exhaled once, a single controlled release of air, and then reached across the table and took both her hands. "I will take care of you," he said. "I know," she said. "I intend to return the favor." They were married in October at the River Bend Church, a plain frame building that was the most ceremonial structure within 30 miles, with Cal Warden as witness and Ruth and Thomas from the Way Station who had made the 30-mile journey for the occasion, and Clara Hutchins with her husband Daniel, and Henry Birch looking uncomfortable in his Sunday collar. The minister was a man named Reverend Hawes, who had been ministering to the frontier for 20 years and had the weather-cut face and steady eyes of a man who had officiated at both the best and worst moments of people's lives and had not been broken by either. Margaret wore a dress she had made herself from a deep blue wool she had ordered from the mercantile in River Bend, precise and well-fitted, and she wore her hair up and carried a small bunch of late-season flowers that Ruth had brought, dried carefully during the journey, Indian paintbrush and lupin, the same as the flowers that had been in the jar on the dresser when she arrived. Emmett stood at the altar in a dark coat that fit him well and looked at her when she came up the aisle with the full, open expression she had learned was his most private face, the one he reserved for moments of significance he could not contain behind the controlled exterior. It was the face of a man who was understanding, in real time, that he has arrived somewhere he had stopped believing he would reach. She thought, walking toward him, of the word in his original advertisement that had finally made her put it back down and reach for the pen. Partner. Not helpmate, not companion, not even wife. Partner. The word that implied equal standing, shared purpose, the kind of arrangement that acknowledged both people brought something essential. She had been right about what it meant. They said the words in the plain-framed church with the autumn wind pressing against the walls and the small congregation watching, and Emmett slid a ring onto her finger, a gold band he had made in Laramie, plain and solid, made to last, and she held his hand and did not let go. The winter that came that year, the winter of 1879 into 1880, was the hardest winter the region had seen in a decade. Clara Hutchins had been right. It came early and it came seriously, the first real snow in October, and by November the ranch was locked in the kind of cold that required everything. The work became survival work, breaking ice in the water trough before the horses could drink, keeping the stove fed through the night, taking inventory of the feed stores with the particular, focused attention of people who understand that mathematics in this context is the difference between living and not. Margaret had been preparing for it since September, since the quality of the air changed, and she had done so with a thoroughness that impressed Cal Warden, who was not easily impressed, and that gave Emmett a specific kind of peace, the peace of a man who has found someone who does not require protection from hard truths. They did not lose a single head of cattle that winter, which was not common in a winter of that severity. They did not lose any of the horses. They did not lose any people. Emmett did not say, and perhaps could not say, but she knew that the winter was a thing he had been dreading since before she arrived, the test that had taken a leaner, the trial by cold. She knew, in the way she knew things about him now, that her steadiness through those months, her practical, unfrightened engagement with the work of survival, was healing something in him that the passage of time alone had not been able to reach. She did not do it for that reason. She did it because it was the life she had chosen, the honest life, the one worth lasting through. But the healing happened anyway. In February, in the deep interior of that hard winter, when the snow was 4 feet against the north side of the house, and the nights were so cold the stars looked like chips of ice, she told him she was with child. He went very still. She watched his face process it, the news traveling through him in stages she could read, surprise, and then a flash of something complex, something that had fear and grief in it alongside the joy, because Emmett Alden was not a man who received good things without also feeling the weight of what he had lost. But then the joy one rose above the rest of it, and he came to her and held her with the careful, full-armed gentleness of a man who is trying to contain something enormous in a small gesture. "All right," he said against her hair. "All right," she agreed. The spring came with its characteristic shock, the way spring comes in that country, not gradually but as a sudden, extravagant reversal, the snow giving way in a week to mud, and then to the first determined green, the creek running high and cold with snowmelt, the sky opening up from its winter gray to that absolute blue. The cattle came through winter thin but mostly sound, and the calves began arriving with the spring grass, and the work of the ranch returned from survival mode to the full, productive rhythm of a solvent operation. Margaret moved through her pregnancy with the same practical attention she brought to everything, monitoring herself honestly, writing to the doctor in River Bend, making arrangements without drama. The doctor came out in late April, a small, precise man named Dr. Featherstone, who had been the only physician in the county for 15 years and who examined her and declared everything entirely sound, and told Emmett, who was waiting on the landing with the controlled expression of a man attempting not to show his terror, that his wife was in excellent health and that he should stop hovering. "I'm not hovering," Emmett said. "You have not moved from that landing in 45 minutes, Doctor." Featherstone said. He had not moved from the landing. The summer of 1880 was gentler than the previous year, and the ranch continued its steady, solvent progress. The cattle numbers were up. The hay crop was good. Emmett took on a fourth permanent hand, a man named Solomon Webb, a black man from Kansas who had been moving through the territory looking for steady work after 3 years of homesteading that had not survived 2 consecutive dry summers on the claim he had filed. He was capable and quiet, and had a particular gift with horses that Cal Warden recognized in the first hour, and that Emmett confirmed in the first week, and he became a permanent part of the ranch's life in the easy, matter-of-fact way that good people find their place. Margaret had a long conversation with Solomon Webb in August while they were both working on the preservation of the summer's vegetable garden, and she learned that his wife had died on the claim in Kansas during the second dry summer, that he had 3 years of grief, that he was still carrying and managing with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. She thought of Emmett and did not say so, but she felt the parallel with a fullness that made her briefly still. She said, "You're welcome here as long as you want to be. That's not provisional." He looked at her steadily. "I appreciate you saying that plain," he said. "I find plain is generally better," she said. Their son was born in September of 1880, on a morning when the first of the autumn color was showing on the aspens along the creek, a vivid, secular gold. He was born in the bedroom of the house, where his father had put wildflowers in a jar for a woman he had not yet met, and the labor was hard and long, and Dr. Featherstone was there, and Ruth had come the 30 miles again, and Emmett was downstairs doing what he always did in a crisis, which was to stay completely still and not demonstrate to anyone how frightened he was. When Ruth came down the stairs and said the word "son," the stillness broke. He went up the stairs 3 at a time, the same way he had taken the hotel stairs in Laramie 15 months before, but different, the same urgency driven by a completely different force. Margaret was tired and pale and entirely herself, and she held the baby with the careful confidence of a woman who had been preparing for this practically as well as emotionally, and she looked at Emmett when he came through the door with the expression of a person presenting something they are proud of. "He has your eyes," she said. Emmett sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and his face was the open face, the private one, and this time he did not try to contain it at all. They named him James, for Emmett's brother who had died of fever in the first year, and the middle name was Thomas, for no particular public reason except that it felt solid. James Emmett Thomas Alden. James, for the first time, was a name this land associated not with loss but with the continuation of something. That winter was milder than the previous one, an ordinary Wyoming winter rather than an extraordinary one, which meant only that the ordinary difficulties applied. Margaret managed them with the full competence of a woman now in her second year on the frontier, and she managed them with a baby on her hip, or in the wooden cradle that Emmett had built through October in the evenings while she read Dickens aloud, a cradle that was square and solid and slightly over-engineered in the way that all of Emmett's constructions were, as though he was building against the possibility that this particular thing might be needed to last a very long time. The ranch continued to grow. Not rapidly, not in the speculative, reckless way of some operations in the territory, but steadily, in the manner of a thing well built and well tended. The cattle numbers increased each year through the early 1880s. Emmett added a second barn in 1881 and a bunkhouse expansion in 1882 that Saul Webb oversaw with the focused, practical intelligence that characterized everything he did. The summer of 1882 brought a second child to the ranch, a girl this time, born in July with the summer heat pressing through the windows, quick and loud, and apparently in excellent spirits about the proceedings, whom they named Alina, and Margaret had been the one to suggest it, had done so quietly one evening in March when she was far along and said simply, "I'd like to name her Alina if you are willing." The quality of silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "Yes," Emmett said, "I'm willing." It was perhaps the most complete sentence he had ever said. Emmett Alden was a loud, determined, joyful person from the beginning, temperamentally unlike her father in almost every way, and entirely unlike her mother in the ways that concerned volume. And she was beloved by every person on the ranch from the first week, including Solomon Webb, who had previously been a man of notably restrained affect, but who was observed on multiple occasions making entirely undignified noises at the baby in the yard, and who denied this each time with complete composure. Henry Birch married a woman from River Bend in the spring of 1882, a woman named Annabel who had a quick mind and a dry sense of humor that matched his, and they built a small house on the south edge of the Alden Range, where Henry had been given a stake of land in recognition of 4 years of reliable service. And Annabel and Margaret became the kind of friends who do not need to see each other constantly, but whose friendship has the specific weight of people who understand each other's lives from the inside. In 1883, the Franklin Holt matter resurfaced briefly and unpleasantly when his lawyer filed an appeal on the conspiracy charges that had the temporary effect of creating uncertainty about the land filing and the water rights. Margaret spent 2 weeks reviewing the territorial legal documents with the same focused competence she had brought to the survey documents in 1879, and identified a secondary argument based on the continuous improvement of the land, the buildings, the fences, the water infrastructure, which had been ongoing for 7 years, and which created an independent claim under territorial statutes regardless of the original filing question. She wrote this out in a clean, precise letter to Emmett's lawyer Peterson, who read it twice and then said to Emmett, who was in his office at the time, that his wife appeared to have an aptitude for legal reasoning that he found both remarkable and somewhat professionally threatening. The appeal failed. Franklin Holt served his full 7 years. The country changed through those years, as all the territory was changing, the railroad pushing further west, the settlements growing, River Bend acquiring a second doctor and a schoolhouse, and a newspaper of its own, thin and opinionated but regular. The territory itself would become a state before the decade was out, Wyoming's path to statehood grinding forward through the territorial legislature. Margaret read about it in the River Bend Gazette, which came out twice weekly and arrived at the ranch on Tuesdays and Fridays in good weather and when possible in bad. She had strong opinions about statehood and about the question of women's suffrage, which Wyoming had in fact already granted to women in its territorial constitution, a fact she had known before she left Cincinnati, and that had been, though she had not advertised this, one of the factors in her decision. She and Emmett talked about it on one of those long evenings in 1883, with James asleep upstairs and Alina also asleep, or at least quiet, and the lamp throwing warm light across the table. "You voted for the territorial delegate election in November," he said. "It was not a question." "I did," she said. "I know. I saw you at the table in River Bend." He was quiet for a moment. "I was glad." She looked at him. "I am not always a man of my time," he said carefully, "in the ways that matter." She reached across the table and put her hand on his. "You wrote partner," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. "I meant it," he said. In 1884, a letter arrived for Margaret. It came from Cincinnati, from a woman named Louise Halpert, who had worked in a shop 2 doors from Mrs. Crane's, and who had found Margaret's address through some chain of inquiry she described in the letter with her characteristic, energetic vagueness. The letter was newsy and warm and full of Cincinnati gossip that Margaret read with a pleasant detachment, the way you read about a country you once visited, but do not intend to return to. At the end of the letter, almost as an aside, Louise mentioned that Mrs. Crane had died the previous winter, and that the shop had been sold to a young couple from Pittsburgh, and that the small room above it was now a storage closet. Margaret read this sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, with the sun coming through the windows in its winter angle, which in Wyoming was low and specific, and hit the table in a particular way she had come to associate with the routine goodness of her daily life. James was at the table doing his letters. He had been doing them since he was 3, following his mother's instruction with a patient diligence that was entirely recognizable as his father's character applied to a different purpose. Eleanor was on the floor near the stove, engaged in a project involving blocks and a piece of rope whose logic was entirely her own. Margaret folded the letter and set it down and looked at her children for a moment. She thought about the small room above Mrs. Crane's shop, the future that had fit her like a garment cut too small. She thought about an advertisement she had read 4 times and almost thrown away. Partner. Emmett came in from the barn at mid-morning for coffee, as was his habit, and he looked at her as he always looked at her, with the full, direct attention that still, after 5 years, had not diminished in its quality. He had more gray at his temples now, just the beginning of it, and the lines in his face were more pronounced, and he was, she thought, the more beautiful for all of it, the way a landscape that has weathered well is more beautiful than one that has not been tested. Letter, he said, noticing it on the table. From Cincinnati, she said. Old news from an old life. She paused. Mrs. Crane died. The room I used to live in is a closet. He poured his coffee and sat down and looked at her. How do you feel about that? She considered the question as she considered most things honestly. Grateful, she said. Deeply grateful. He reached across the table. She gave him her hand. James looked up from his letters and observed his parents holding hands with the resigned tolerance of a child who has been exposed to affection often enough to find it predictable, and said, "Papa, when can I come on the roundup?" 3 more years, Emmett said, without looking away from Margaret. You said that last year, James said. I'll keep saying it until it's true, Emmett said. Margaret laughed, which she did easily and often now, and the sound of it traveled through the warm kitchen and out past the window glass, where the winter sun was doing its low, particular work on the snow-covered yard. The spring of 1885 brought something none of them had planned for, and that rearranged the ordinary rhythms of the ranch in ways that were permanent. Saul Webb, who had been riding north along the fence line on a Tuesday in April, came back to the ranch in the late afternoon with a Shoshone woman named Lee riding double behind him on his horse, a woman he had found alone on the open range near the fence with a broken ankle, 2 miles from any shelter, in the second hour of a fast-dropping temperature. He brought her in, and Margaret set the ankle, which she had learned to do properly from Dr. Featherstone, and the woman stayed 4 days while it was stabilized enough for travel. On the second day, when she could sit up at the table for meals, Lee spoke English that was precise and careful, and she and Margaret talked for an hour about the Wind River country and the changes coming and what they meant for the Shoshone people who had been on this land for generations before any of them arrived. Margaret listened to this, the way she listened to all things that mattered, which was with her whole attention, and she said the true thing, which was that she was aware that the land the ranch sat on had its own prior history that legal filings did not erase, and that she was aware, further, that the story of her life here and the story of Lee's people were not separate stories, but were part of the same complicated, ongoing American story with all of its injustices that still had no resolution. And that she did not say this to create comfort but because it was the truth. Lee looked at her for a long moment. You are honest, she said. "I try to be," Margaret said. On the fourth day, when two men from Lee's band came to bring her home, Saul Webb was in the yard repairing a saddle, and he stood when they came and helped Lee to her horse with a care that was unmistakable in its quality, and she looked at him once before she rode out, and the look said something complete that neither of them put into words. Over the following months, Saul rode north along the fence line more often than the fence required. Nobody mentioned it. Cal Warden mentioned it once, to Emmett, who told him in 2 sentences that Saul Webb's private life was his own business, and that the fence along the north boundary had, in fact, needed more attention than it had been getting. Cal considered this. "You're not wrong about the fence," he said. By the summer of 1885, Saul and Lee were a fact, simply and without announcement, and she was at the ranch often, helping with the summer work with a competence and a particular knowledge of the land and its seasons that added something valuable to the ranch's collective understanding. She and Margaret had the friendship of women who do not require the same background to recognize the same quality in each other. Emmett watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has built something that is more than the sum of his own intentions. In the evenings, after the children were asleep and the day's work was accounted for, he and Margaret sat together in the habit of years, sometimes talking, sometimes not, sometimes reading, sometimes simply present with each other, and the particular quality of peace that their life had built up, layer by layer, through everything they had done together. One evening in the autumn of 1885, with the aspens doing their extravagant gold thing along the creek again, and James in his 7th year growing tall with his father's economy of movement and Alina in her 4th year, absolutely his opposite in that regard, and 2 more years of life at the Alden ranch settled into him like rings in wood. Emmett said something he had been accumulating toward for some time, without entirely knowing it. He said, "I used to think that what I needed out here was someone who could last, someone tough enough, hardy enough, someone the country wouldn't break. And now," she said. He was looking at the mountains in the last light, the wind rivers doing what they did every evening, going from gold to rose to the precise color of something that has no name. "Now I think I had it backward," he said. "I didn't need someone who could last the country. I needed someone worth lasting for." He paused. "You changed the arithmetic. Before you, surviving was the point. It was the whole calculation. After you," he stopped and she waited, knowing he would find it. "After you, surviving was just the method. The point was something else entirely." She was quiet for a moment. The creek ran in the creek bed, and the aspens moved in the evening air, and the mountains went on doing what mountains do. "I needed someone worth lasting for," she said, and the word was weighted with the full understanding of what she had been doing when she answered an advertisement she almost threw away. "I needed a reason that was larger than endurance. I needed a life that was worth the difficulty of living it." He turned and looked at her and she at him, in the clear, complete way of people who have long since stopped managing what the other person might see. "We found it," he said. "We did," she said. The evening finished its work on the mountains, and the stars came out as they always did in Wyoming, with an extravagance that had never stopped making Margaret slightly breathless, no matter how many thousand times she had seen it. And they sat there together in the cooling air with the life they had built around them, and the life still ahead of them extending outward like the land itself, enormous and largely unmapped and full of difficulty, and full of everything else. James Alden in his 8th year discovered that he had, in addition to his father's character, his mother's capacity for reading, and devoured the collected Dickens, and then the natural history, and then began demanding that someone order more books from the Laramie bookseller, which Margaret did immediately and with great pleasure. He also turned out to have a genuine gift with numbers that his teacher at the River Bend schoolhouse, a young woman named Miss Patterson, who was 23, and from Pennsylvania, and finding her own footing in the frontier with a combination of intelligence and stubbornness that Margaret recognized as familiar, identified and nurtured, with the focused attention of a teacher who knows when she has encountered something worth the effort. Emmett Alden, in her 5th year, began following Cal Warden everywhere with a focused, interested attention that Cal met with the resigned stoicism of a man who had imagined that his foreman responsibilities did not extend to explaining cattle sorting to a 5-year-old, but had revised this understanding. She knew the name of every horse by the end of her 5th year, and had opinions about each of them that were, Cal told Emmett privately, more or less accurate. In 1886, Margaret told Emmett she was expecting again, in March, and this time he received the news with the full, uncomplicated joy of a man who has understood by now that joy is not a betrayal of what he lost, but is a continuation of what he loved. He held her, and she felt his relief in addition to his happiness, the relief of a man who has learned that the country and he can coexist with good things, that the land does not take everything. Their second son was born in October of 1886, which was notable partly because it was another October and the aspens were gold again. And Emmett made a remark about the apparent preference of his children for the season that made Margaret laugh from the bed while still engaged in labor, which Dr. Featherstone said was a first in his experience. They named him Robert Daniel Alden, Robert for Margaret's father, Daniel because it sat well next to Robert, and from the first days of his life he was a placid, observant baby who regarded the world with a calm, steady interest that was entirely recognizable, and that made Emmett, when he held him, smile in a way that held no complexity, only the pure thing. The Alden Ranch in the late 1880s was a full thing. A house with a wide porch facing south, and 3 children in various stages of becoming themselves, and a foreman who had been there from the beginning and hands who had worked there long enough to have histories with the place, and Solomon Webb and Lee who were, by 1887, married in the Shoshone way, and living in a house they had built on the northern edge of the range near the fence line that Saul had been patrolling with such dedication. And Ruth and Thomas at the way station, 30 miles south, who came for holidays and stayed for 3 days and improved everything, and Clara and Daniel Hutchins in River Bend, who had become the closest thing to family that distance permitted. And at the center of it, the specific fact of 2 people who had found each other through an advertisement and an act of courage, who had been tested by a trap and a betrayal and a winter that could have been fatal, and the long, ordinary test of daily life, which is perhaps the hardest test of all, and who had arrived, through all of it, at a life that was genuinely and specifically theirs. Margaret Barrett Alden was 33 in 1887, and she was not the woman who had unfolded a newspaper over her breakfast in Cincinnati 8 years before, except that she was entirely that woman, only more fully inhabited. The instrument she had been then was the same instrument she was now, the same steady constitution, the same direct attention, the same refusal of comfortable untruths. The difference was that the instrument was now being played in the right register. The difference was that she had found the life that deserved what she had to offer. On a Sunday in the autumn of 1887, with James now 9 years old and reading everything he could get hands on, and Alina nearly 7 and beginning to come into the particular ferocity that would define her, and Robert 13 months and pulling himself up on the furniture with an expression of focused ambition, Emmett Alden stood on the porch of his house with his wife beside him and looked out at the land that had cost him so much and given him everything. The Wind River foothills and the creek and the aspens and the sky, the enormous, indifferent, magnificent sky. "I want to tell you something," he said. Margaret waited the way she had always known how to wait for him, without pressure, with full attention. "When I put that advertisement in the paper," he said, "I had a list of requirements, practical things, sound mind, steady constitution. I had written them down and I meant them. I did not put on the list," he stopped, started again. "I did not put on the list that she would be brave or funny, or that she would read the survey documents on her 6th day here and find the thing the lawyer had missed. I did not put that she would understand Aliner's name and offer it without being asked. I did not put that she would change what the word home means to me. Margaret was quiet. I'm telling you this, he said, because I don't say things unless I mean them. And I have meant every word I have said to you since Laramie, but I haven't said all the words. So, he turned to look at her directly in the way he had looked at her since that first night, with nothing behind the glass. I love you, Margaret, not as a condition of the arrangement, not as a fact of the marriage, as the specific, irreplaceable, fortunate truth of my life. She looked at him, the man who had ridden 36 hours through the dark, who had put wildflowers in a jar, who had built a cradle over-engineered enough to last 3 children, who had said the word partner and meant it, who had healed by degrees in the years of their life together from the grief that had closed him, and was now, visibly and completely, open. I love you, she said. I have loved you since the second day on the wagon road when you named the mountains for me. I have loved you since the morning I found you had not moved from the landing for 45 minutes. I have loved you in the way that doesn't require permission and doesn't ask for anything in return except that you go on being exactly who you are. He reached for her hand. She gave it. Below them, the creek ran its course toward the river. The aspens made their annual argument for gold, and the Wyoming sky stretched itself out above everything with its habitual, extravagant indifference, enormous and clear and full of stars that were not yet visible but were there, waiting for the dark. Inside the house, James Alden was reading a book about the natural world. Emmett Alden was explaining something at considerable volume to Robert, who was listening with the calm, observant expression that was already his trademark. Solomon, Webb, and Lee were riding up from the north fence in the evening light, and Cal Warden was in the barn doing the last check of the evening, with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who has found his right place in the world. The ranch settled toward night. The man who had needed someone to last the harsh country stood on his porch, holding the hand of the woman who had needed someone worth lasting for, and the harsh country lay before them, real and demanding and beautiful beyond the capacity of any adequate word. And they were both still here, which was not everything but was the beginning and the foundation of everything, and they were here together, which was the thing that made the difference. The thing that made the vast, indifferent country into something that could be called, without irony or delusion, home. The stars came out. The night was cold and clear and full. It would be cold tomorrow, and the day after, and the winters would come as they always came, with all their full intention. There would be work and difficulty and loss, and the specific, daily test of a life lived at a hard elevation. There would be children growing and children making their own choices, and the ranch passing through its seasons with the demands that seasons brought. But on this evening in the autumn of 1887, on the porch of a house where wildflowers had once been placed in a jar for a woman not yet arrived, 2 people stood in the specific, earned warmth of a life built on honest foundations, and they held on to each other the way you hold on to something you understand the value of, which is to say, completely, and without the plan of ever letting go.